Well, hello again, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is part 3 of our Healthy Relationship series, which is on romantic partners. We do want to ask you to go ahead and take a moment to type your name into the chat box so we can keep up with attendance for today's seminar. It helps us to make sure that we can match names with whatever screen name that you use in the chat when you log in. Today, we're going to be talking about like I said, romantic partnerships. Well, if you would like, you're welcome to use the chat box to post questions or offer your thoughts or ideas or suggestions, because we all learn from each other as much as we learn from what we're going to be sharing today. We will try to get to all of your questions, but if we can't, we definitely will consider them and include them in future offerings when we offer this again. Relationships are the heart of all human interactions. And in session 1, we discussed family relationships. In session 2, we covered friendships. Again, today we're going to talk about romantic partnerships, intimate partnerships. And then in a couple of weeks, we'll be wrapping up with talking about workplace relationships. All 4 sessions are being recorded, and we will post the videos in the very near future. So we want to make sure that let you know that. So if you're not able to stay for the whole amount of time, it will definitely be available to you later. And we will also send out a copy of the PowerPoint in a week, in the next couple of days, in the next, by the end of the week, hopefully, so that everyone here today will have a copy of that. And so today we're going to be talking about the importance of our individual and relationship vision when it comes to our intimate partners and our values. We're going to look at the foundations of healthy relationships, talk about the importance of connection and communication, and managing conflict. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to be Rhonda will be referring to a lot of different resources. Those will be at the end of the PowerPoint, and you will have the links to those when you receive the PowerPoint. So again, just sit back and listen. We're going to give all this information to you afterwards, so that, because we know that we can only touch on a lot of these topics in an hour's time. So we want to make sure that we give you lots to take home with you as well. Okay, next slide, Rhonda. So we want to start off talking about what we mean by romantic relationships. So an intimate relationship is an interpersonal relationship that involves emotional or physical closeness between people, and it may include sexual intimacy and feelings of romance or love. So healthy relationships is what we're going to be talking about today. And healthy relationships involve honesty, trust, respect, and open communication between partners. And they take effort and compromise on the part of both people. There's no imbalance of power in healthy relationships. Partners respect each other's independence and can make their own decisions without fear or retribution or retaliation, and they can have shared decision making. So that's, again, what we're going to be focusing on today, is whether or not they meet this criteria of a healthy relationship. I want to talk about, and we're going to talk about different types of relationships. So we're talking married or unmarried. We're talking about cohabitating or long distance. We're talking about partnerships regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity, straight, gay, non-binary, queer, asexual, gender fluid, cisgender, monogamy, polyamory, open relationships. We're talking about romantic partnerships of any kind. But we are not talking about some things today. We're not going to be talking about issues of domestic violence or abuse, but we have included some of those resources related to this at the end. And we want to remind you that if you are in an unsafe relationship, you can always call the 800 number here to reach local and confidential help. Because what we're not talking about today are relationships where there is this imbalance of power. Unhealthy relationships are characterized by power and control. And when one partner is taking the power away from another partner and has control over that person or that relationship, this is when you begin to see unhealthy and abusive tendencies. And that abuse, again, can be emotional or psychological, verbal, physical, or sexual in nature. So that's the kind of relationships we won't be talking about today. We also want to encourage you, if you are seeking out help with that kind of relationship, despite this, in addition to the 800 number, that you're always welcome to come and talk to one of us as therapists, or ask us for more resources. We are here to help with that. So now Rhonda's going to take over and dig into today's information.
All right. Thank you, Kim. So, you all, I love talking about this topic. I'm so glad that you all joined us today. Let's jump in with starting out talking about this idea of our North Star vision. So, if you've heard us in any of these relationship series sessions, you've heard of the sort of framework of North Star. And for the purposes of today's discussion, this idea is what is sort of leading our way when it comes to our romantic partnerships. What are the things that are our guiding sort of principles, values around this? And if that's one of those things that you want to think about a little bit more, sometimes some questions like the ones that I just populated on the screen can be helpful. Being able to look at things like, give me one second, what do I consider to be a healthy and satisfying relationship? What kind of partner do I want to be? What are some of those top values that I have? How much do those values influence my relationship? And in some ways, how much is a priority is that relationship in my life at this time? So no like right or wrong answers to questions like this. And these aren't, the definitive questions we have to ask, but just some samples to kind of get us in that headspace and thinking about who do I want to be? What am I looking for? What's kind of leading the way? Because I think having some of that personal understanding, of where that relationship sets in your life and how you want to show up, what you need in response, it really helps us when we are kind of on the path when we come across some of these problems. We're all going to have sort of life stressors that come up, conflicts that come up, decisions we've got to make, figuring out how to navigate when we're trying to maybe dealing with two different sort of life goals or career goals in my partnership. If we can come back to thinking about again, where do those values set? What's important to me? What kind of priority is this in my life? I think it makes it a little bit easier to navigate some of those things. And we're going to talk about how do we handle some of this stuff? How do we handle old baggage, or how do we handle conflict when it's coming up, or setting boundaries. So we're going to touch on some of these things during this hour. But I really would encourage you to think about again, what is that sort of value piece that's underpinning? Where does this relationship set and what's important to me? And I think, if you notice that sort of that values piece is maybe interesting, but you don't have a lot of clarity on it, sometimes doing a values activity can be useful. We put one at the end in those resources that Kim mentioned. So Brene Brown has a values activity that can be useful. And that might be a way of exploring that a little bit more if that piques your interest, but you're not quite clear kind of on where it sets and what those answers are for you. When we think about sort of what makes up a healthy relationship, I think to me that's the starting place. When Kim and I were talking about this series, it was really important to us that we talk about how do we sort of amplify things that are working in relationships, and how do we sort of bring in new tools or new approaches when things are maybe not quite on track. So let's start with this idea of what makes up the healthy relationship in the first place. And so for this framework, I'm going to be pulling a lot of material in this chunk today from John Gottman's work. And so the Gottman Institute is going to be referenced a lot in those resources at the end of the program. And that's where this framework and this theory comes in about the sound relationship house. Certainly, if you're somebody who likes to kind of read the articles, dig in, go a little bit deeper, Gottman's information and his online kind of catalog of just tons of good information is a really good place to go to. So again, we've linked some specific articles that we think kind of touch on some of the issues that we're going to talk about today, but it's a really good place to get some good quality, more in-depth information as well. So let's kind of go through this relationship house floor by floor and kind of unpack a little bit about what he's talking about in this. So it starts with the idea of building love maps. And so the building love maps layer is really where we're getting to deeply know our partner. So this is beyond, what's your favorite color, or where'd you go to school? Those kind of get to know you starter questions. This is understanding those deeper levels of what makes up this person. So it's understanding a little bit about what their history is, and also what meaning that history has. So if we're with a partner, and I'll use examples a lot as I kind of go through the hour, because I think it just illustrates some of these points more easily. So if you've got a partner who maybe grew up in a family where a divorce came as a result of infidelity, you may have a lot of baggage there that person's bringing into a relationship. A lot of, I think, the work to understand how they see the world, how things impacted them, how they grew up, some of those layers in there can be really helpful just again to get that deeper knowledge beyond just who are we today, but I want to go deeper. I want to know you more. That next floor is the idea of sharing fondness and admiration. So this is the idea of being able to kind of articulate what we love about our partner. Now, when we want to focus on that piece, it does not mean that is at the exclusion of dealing with problems that come up. Trust me, we are going to talk about managing conflict, managing differences. It's a big chunk of what this hour is going to be on. But part of what we don't want to leave out in this mix is sharing that fondness and admiration. So reminding ourselves, sharing with others why we care about them. This is one of those places, and some of these things I think may seem kind of obvious on the surface level, but I want us to think of it a step or two deeper with each of these. So with this one, again, sharing what we like about someone seems kind of easy and straightforward. But one place that I see that get off track really quickly and sort of without bad intention, but maybe with bad outcome, is some of those sort of relationship tropes or stereotypes. So think about those things that we hear about, for women, it might be, she just goes and shops all the time and spends all the money and just can't figure out the budget. And for the guys, maybe it's, oh, he doesn't even know how to change a diaper and he's going to babysit his kids. And some of those things that again, there might be a thread of some truth somewhere in something, but how does that end up making us think about our partner? How does that end up kind of putting our partner in spaces where we're talking to our family about what's going on, or we're talking to friends about, what has been happening in our lives? Being aware and being able to elevate and share and also give examples and stories that show our partners successes, that show the traits that we really care about in them, emphasizing and amplifying that part of them that we really connect to it and why we love them. It helps us remember that. And it also is just a way of, again, kind of supporting them, in all those spaces we might find ourselves in. The idea of turning toward our partner, this idea of bids for connection, we're going to actually go into that in a little more depth in the next couple of slides, because that's what I want us to talk about a little bit more. But let me just for the sake of this slide, for this part of the conversation, let me mention a couple of things there. I think, often when we have in any relationship, and so many of these things are truly transferable outside of romantic partnerships, but in our romantic partnerships, I think sometimes when we are struggling a little bit, we find ourselves kind of looking for one big solution. Tell me the thing I need to do, and I will do the thing, and I will make this better. And we feel sometimes kind of the discomfort of things not feeling right can feel so big that we feel like we've got to bring in some really big sort of intervention, to change it. And that may be the case sometimes. But what I find is much more common and much more realistic is often it's these small day-to-day connections where we are able to turn toward our partner and connect with them that actually really build that feeling of safety, security, and trust that we're mostly looking for in those partnerships. So we're going to break that down, like I said, in the next couple slides and give some examples there. But I think, again, we'll come back to that one. Being able to look at them the fourth floor, if I can get those words out, is looking at that positive perspective. So I think this one to me is kind of similar to the second floor, but I think one of the differences in this one is some of those assumptions we make about our partner. So assuming good intent. And again, this isn't burying conflict or ignoring problematic behavior that needs to be addressed, but it's reminding ourselves that even when we are in the middle of a struggle, we are not necessarily assuming that our partner's wanting something bad for us or that they are coming at us from a selfish point of view. We're assuming that they're also trying to figure out the problem or get a solution. Looking at that fifth floor, again, this is one that we're going to go into in quite a bit more depth throughout this hour. But let's talk about a couple of aspects around conflict management that I think are good kind of starting spaces in terms of this sort of building that strong house. So if we're building that strong relationship house and we're thinking about conflict, we want to first be able to acknowledge that there's some mutual impact. So even if there's an issue that maybe I'm the one kind of driving the discussion on, I'm the one really wanting some resolution or concerned about it, there is impact in anything in that couple relationship or partnered relationships. There is going to be impact on everybody who is involved. It may be different. It may be different in terms of how it impacts us and also how heavy the impact feels. Um, Also being able to look at those differences between solvable and perpetual problems. Y'all, there's like a whole slide. We're going to dig into that one quite a bit more. But I think one of the things that can be helpful for us just to start recognizing is that there are different kinds of problems. Not everything falls into the same sort of bucket. And so if we've got something that's solvable, we might have one approach to it. If we have something that's perpetual, we might need to approach that differently. And so we're going to get into that in a few minutes when we talk about some of the tools to manage some of these things. And then also being able to be able to manage our own self-soothing behavior. And so if we're in the midst of conflict, if we're having difficult conversations, being able to know how to take care of my own emotions. Do I need to step back? Do I need to get my thoughts in order? Do I need to settle, my emotions and do a little self-soothing, go outside, walk around the block for a minute, take some deep breaths so that I'm able to come back into that conversation and not only express what I'm actually trying to express, but slow down enough to be able to actually hear what my partner is trying to share with me as well. So again, we're going to break some of those down in a little bit more detail as we talk through that actual sort of steps within conflict resolution and management. That floor six is this idea of sort of making our dreams come true, this, working together toward goals and dreams. So, we may have our individual things that we're wanting to do. I may have career goals that I want, or I may have, health and wellness kind of goals that I'm working on. But we also want to look at how do we make those bigger life dreams come true together? So in partnership, how do we support each other? If we're coming into a chapter where, okay, maybe my partner's going back to school and it's going to look really different in terms of kind of how we allocate resources and what time looks like. How do we support each other so that those bigger picture goals are working for both of us and we're actually both getting our needs met, even if one of us is more in the forefront in a certain chapter? This idea of creating shared meaning, I think for me, I think the floor seven and one kind of are a little bit of a kind of a companion maybe to each other. I think that first floor, that building love maps, is about kind of appreciating the individual, what we bring into the relationship, what our background is, what meaning is there for us, in certain things. I think in floor seven, we're talking about our partnership culture. You know, in this house, we do things this way. In this relationship, we do things this way. So, this is how we build sort of our meaning as a couple, how we approach things, how we do things. And I think it's one of those places where sort of identifying how you want that to look. Again, going back to that North Star vision. What do we want our home to be like? Maybe I grew up in a family where I never saw conflict addressed in an open way. So, when there was a problem, it was just all this passive aggressive, under the surface stuff. Well, if that's important to me, that I not bring that into my next, my home, and whether that's raising children in that space or being with a partner in that space, being able to do things so that we create shared meaning, we create shared values, and we do that work together to try to build the reality to match that. And then that idea of sort of the weight-bearing walls of trust and commitment, those kind of side pieces that support everything else that we're doing. I think this sort of touches back to what Kim was mentioning earlier around, why we're not bringing in domestic violence as part of this conversation, because we don't have time to address it fully and appropriately in this hour. But if we're talking about healthy relationships, those core pieces of trust and commitment, we have to have those pieces there. When trust is in doubt, when commitment to the relationship is in doubt, we have bigger issues that we may need to really resolve. And, we may need some help doing that, talking to a counselor or really having bigger, deeper conversations about the future of that relationship. But I think when that trust and commitment are there and feel solid, then we can work on these different layers and sort of building these different pieces that enrich the relationship and really deepen our connection to one another. All right. So let's talk about this idea of bids for connection for a minute. I'm going to let you read some of the comments on the left or the words on the left there on those bullet points. The idea of the bids for connection, it's any type of sort of attempt for connection and communication. So some may be really overt. We may be kind of putting something out there. Hey, I'd like you to come watch the show with me. Some might be much more subtle, and we're going to go through a couple of examples in just a second. But every time that our partner wants to connect with us, or we want to connect with them, and we turn toward them, we're building more emotional connection. Again, keeping in mind that idea that sometimes that sort of romanticized version of partnerships can lead us to think about big gestures, big events or things like that that are going to be meaningful. And there may be a big gesture that feels really meaningful. Your partner may do something that feels really important to you, and it was a big gesture, and a lot of effort went into that. But what I find is focusing on these day-to-day connections is where we get a lot of bang for our buck. Okay. So let's kind of talk through one of those and how it might kind of play out. So if I go home today and I say to my partner, I gave that presentation today, I was so nervous. I start kind of talking about how things went. They've got a couple of sort of options in how they can respond to that. So if we're doing that turning toward, I'm getting some engagement. Oh, really? I forgot that was today. Tell me how it went. How was it? What did they think? And so they're engaging with me. They're seeing me, they're paying attention. They are kind of coming into the space that I've kind of created. I've opened this up and they're joining me in that conversation. The other option they have, or one of the other options they have, is that idea of turning away. Maybe they acknowledge me, they give a little bit of a response. Oh, okay, and they kind of go right back to what they're doing. So they acknowledge me. They didn't necessarily say something mean or inappropriate, but certainly not very meaningful, and can leave us feeling a little bit bereft in that. And then at that kind of further end, when we get more in this sort of red zone, we can actually have that turning against. You can get some snarky comments coming back at us. Whatever. Can't you see I'm working? Or, thank God, you've been talking about that all week. And they go back to what they're doing. How are we feeling in those moments? Those moments, you all, are so, so important. The research that Gottman does around this supports it in such, to me, a profound way. Gottman followed, a group of newly married folks over a 6-year span. And what they found is that at that 6-year mark, they saw that couples that were still married were turning toward each other. They're picking up those bids and connecting in those moments, those small day-to-day moments, 86% of the time. Couples that divorced were turning toward each other about 33% of the time. And I'm not saying that's the only thing that was going on or the only marker that sort of explains where their relationship went. But it definitely shows us that there is a vast difference in how we feel and how we might respond when these things are being handled in a way that feels meaningful and that feels like it's an actual it's being received, and our partner is acknowledging it. I think if we're looking for something that gives us a lot of impact on our relationship pretty quickly, doing some work around this area can be a really good investment. I think it's a good space to think about again, how does my partner turn toward me or not? Also, it's a good place to do some self-reflection, which is a theme you're going to kind of hear throughout this hour about how do I show up? You know, do I take time for that? Do I pay attention? Do I slow down? When my partner mentions something, sort of drops a comment, I think that's sort of the visual that comes to mind for me a lot. Do I go and pick it up? Do I go and sort of pay attention to it? And again, it's one of those places where I think we can make a pretty quick investment just by some small kind of recalibrations. All right. So let's think through some of these sort of practical connection ideas. And I'm not going to touch on every one of these. Some of these are very common sense and you can read it. And y'all bear with me. I've got to move my screen a little bit. There we go. To be able to see all of these. So I'm going to touch on the ones that have the stars by them. Again, some of these are really kind of obvious. And it's not necessarily they're the most complex things in the world. But I think remembering sometimes just even the day-to-day stuff that we can sometimes get out of the habit of doing. So let's talk about a couple of the ones that I've starred there because I want to go in a little more depth on those. Let's start with the idea of setting a routine time to connect. I think that it's easy again in those sort of romanticized visions of what a relationship should be. And if you can't see me, I'm using the big air quotes for that one. But we can get into what the relationship should be and how we expect that we should be spending time together. And sometimes we want that to feel like it flows very naturally and that we're not having to plan anything. I will hear folks with some resistance to the idea of like date nights or having time set aside for intimacy and connection. We will talk a lot about that in a couple minutes. But having a routine time to connect. Y'all, think about the reality of our lives. We're all working. I mean, most of us, that's why we're here. I may have some retirees in the mix that are on with us today, but we're working jobs. Many of us have other responsibilities, whether that is extended family, whether that's raising kids, pets, medical issues, home issues. There's a lot of things that is going to be pulling at our attention, on any given day. And so when something is a priority, when we want to make sure we don't forget it or something gets the attention it needs, what do? We sometimes put it on a calendar or we build it into a routine. If it's important that I wash my face, I'm going to do it at this time every night. So I get in the routine of doing it. Setting a routine time to connect with our partner does not mean that that is the only time we want to connect with them. It doesn't mean that that's the only time we're going to go on a date or have sex or whatever the things are that we're wanting to do. But it makes sure that our relationship doesn't get lost in the shuffle of the day to day. That we don't look up and good grief, it's been 3 or 4 weeks since we've done that thing that we used to like to do. It's been 2 or 3 weeks since we've just had some time alone together and just the two of us have went out and done something together. So giving ourselves some space to set aside some routine times to check in, to make space for each other, it makes sure that again we keep up with the things that are important to us. The idea of doing a two-person sort of book club or podcast club, I really like this one. I think this one is especially helpful if folks struggle to kind of spend time together during the week. So maybe we're working different shifts. Maybe we work jobs that just kind of keep us, super busy. And so we come back together on the weekend or we get a chance to come back together long distance. Y'all, this is a great one. If we've got any long distance time that comes in for us. So that when we're on our own, we might be reading that same book or we're listening to some podcast episodes we picked out. And then when we come back together, we're checking in on that. We're just able to kind of have that common thing that we can really quickly drop into. It also can be helpful if we find ourselves bickering about some day-to-day stuff to have something that's neutral that we can talk about. We can talk about this podcast and we might both think that whoever was on the podcast was, full of it and we just thought they had the worst ideas ever, but we're still talking to each other about what we think about that thing and we're getting a chance to be allied together. We're getting a chance to either enjoy something together or dissect it together. And I think for some of us, especially when life gets super busy, we sometimes lose some of those intellectual connections. Sometimes that's a piece we like with each other, and we don't always have time to do that. Or, I'm reading a book club with my girlfriends over here, and my partner's doing something in kind of his circle over there, and we're not getting that overlap time. So if that's something that you feel like has been maybe a good connection, a connection you've lost, that's an easy way to bring that back in. And then just the idea of spending time in the same space. So we may not be doing the same thing. I might be reading a book, my partner might be gaming, or we might be outside doing two different things. But even just being in that same space together, just kind of sharing the experience together in a very low demand, again, we're not having to interact. I'm not really wanting you to talk to me or come over and do a whole lot, but we're just sharing space together. And so even those kind of low key, low demand spaces, it can be really helpful for us when we're not feeling as connected. We're looking just for more opportunity with limited time and resources. Okay. So when we look at some of these sort of tools for connection, bear with me as I arrange my screen so I can see everything. Again, we've talked about a couple of these, but a couple I want to sort of point out, and we're going to go in more depth on the team meetings in just a second. There's a lot of good online tools at this point. The Paired app is one that I know I use in my personal life, and it prompts questions for both partners that you can both respond and kind of interact with each other on. There are lots of good apps out there in this way, online tools that we can use. I've linked some of those at the end. I think there's even an article about like 11, fun apps for couples to share, that sort of thing. So it's an easy way to again build something in. So I'm not just relying on my over demanded brain to remember like, oh yeah, send my partner a message this morning or do this thing because it would be nice. It gives me a little bit of a prompt to keep that connection going. Using something like a couples journal, and again, this is going to be in the resources, so it'll explain it a little bit more, but where we're actually writing and essentially to each other, and we might pass that back and forth once a week. I think this can be especially useful if we've got maybe some perpetual problems we're trying to sort through. We'll talk about those in a minute. Some bigger things that we're trying to kind of make sense of. Using a couples journal, it can do a couple of things that I think are useful. One is for the person in the partnership that maybe needs a little more time to gather thoughts. This gives them some time to gather their thoughts, to write down what they're thinking, to really say what is meaningful or what they're trying to say. The other part that I think is useful is being able sometimes to go back and reread those passages. So if my partner has maybe reassured me in an area that I was needing some reassurance, if I can go back and read that when I'm feeling maybe a little more insecure, or I'm struggling a little bit, that may be something that is able to again make me feel that connection and remind me, when they've taken the time to slow down and articulate something that was meaningful, I'm able to go back and revisit that. So the couples journaling, again, there's a few different ways that can be used, but if that sparks interest for you, if that idea of writing out things instead of having to sort of be on the hot seat to say something is appealing, check out a couple of those articles. Think about that maybe a little bit more. The idea of sort of ruts versus routines, I always think this one's a fun one because I always am sort of questioning those myself. I like a good routine, but I will sometimes wonder, like, okay, now is it becoming a rut? And there can sometimes be a fine line between those two things. Hold on. Our brains do well with routine. We do well with kind of knowing what's coming, having some routines built in, and we tend to thrive and do pretty well with those. But we know that those can become ruts pretty easily. And I think to me, one of the sort of easy ways to differentiate between those is how much attentiveness we give to it. Do we check in with each other? A good example, for my partner and I, when we get to Friday night, usually we're just kind of exhausted from the work week. We don't really want to go out or do a whole lot at that point. So our routine is typically to get carry out and watch, a show or a movie or something that night and just be super low key at the house. But if that is working for me, that's great. What I can do to kind of, if I'm worried that might be turning into a rut, is check in with my partner. Being able to say, like, hey, this works for me. Is that still good with you? And maybe he says, yeah, it's absolutely what I want to do too. We are on the same page. Great. He might say, actually, every once in a while, I'd kind of like to go out, or every once in a while, I'd like to do this. All right, well, let's negotiate. That takes us then into a space where we can talk about that. And I can give a little bit or he can give a little bit. But I think the attentiveness to routines, being able to check in, not assuming that, what worked for us 5 years ago is still working for us, or what worked for us 5 months ago is still working for us. That's that communication piece, checking in, just getting that reassurance and being willing to sort of, again, recalibrate a little bit if we need to. All right. Now let's talk about team meetings because team meetings are one of my absolute favorite tools to use with couples. If any of you all have seen me for individual therapy around couple relationships, you have likely heard me talk about this. Team meetings are not my invention. This is coming from Gottman's Institute. He calls them State of the Union meetings, and I think they are one of the best things that we can invest in. So y'all, there's a lot of words on the screen. Okay, I get that. I'm going to talk us through this. Obviously, you're going to get all this information, just like Kim mentioned. And there's a link actually in there that goes into Gottman's description of this in a lot more detail in the resources as well. The idea of a team meeting, kind of in just plain speak, again, you're going to have all the details here. The idea of the team meeting is we set a routine time to come together and talk about sort of the business of our relationship, what's going on that needs some attention. And so it may sound like an odd comparison, but I swear it works in my brain at least to compare this to kind of a healthy staff meeting. In a healthy, well-functioning unit, and we all know there's staff meetings that can go off the rails, but when things are working the way that we want them to, we've got some standing items that we're going to check in on. We're checking to see, does anybody have anything new going on? Does anybody need help with anything? Anything unexpected we're kind of dealing with so that things don't get away from us. We're not going to have a project at work, hopefully, and just leave it hanging out there for months on end without checking in. And what's our progress and what do we need on this? So when we think about some of those aspects that come up within our relationships or with our romantic partnerships, what are some of the things that are sometimes harder to get resolution on and it's sometimes harder to talk about? Those are the things that we need to pull into the team meeting. In my suggestions when I'm working with folks, the ones I typically would put on the agenda are going to be talking about money, talking about our sex life, division of chores, labor, parenting, if that applies, and any other things that we tend to avoid. Because part of what we want to do, and we're going to talk in a second about differences among anybody in partnerships. We know that within any partnership, somebody is a little more ready to talk about something and deal with it than the other one is, even if we're both pretty avoidant or even if we're both pretty direct. Somebody's a little more ready for this. For the person who is chomping at the bit and ready to get into this, we need to talk about this budget. The holidays are coming up and we're going to be spending money. We've really got to get a handle on this. For that person, if I know, okay, Saturday morning is when we do our team meeting and we get our coffee and we sit at the kitchen table and we got our calendars and we got our phones and like we think through what's going on, then I can sort of hold my horses a little bit. I don't have to bring it up all the time when maybe my partner's really tired, getting ready for bed. We're trying to do three other things because I know come Saturday morning, we're going to be cued in with each other. We're going to be here for business. We're going to get have the distractions down to a minimum as best we can. And we're going to be ready to talk about this thing. I'm going to have my stuff in order that I want to say and get my thoughts together. For the person who maybe is more reluctant to talk, this also gives them that same prompt. Okay, this is maybe really hard for me to talk about money. Maybe in that love maps, learning about each other, maybe I've got a lot of baggage about money. Maybe I really grew up with money being the source of a lot of conflict. So I really struggle to step into those conversations. So when that's the case, and I know Saturday morning is our time we come together to do this, then I'm able to do some self-regulation around that. I'm able to do some self-talk. Okay, get your thoughts together, write down your notes, kind of get ready to go into this conversation. I think being able to have a specific time that we meet so we know we can count on that. Agreeing on the topics, they don't have to be the topics I suggested. Those are just some that I tend to find pretty successfully kind of managed in this setup. Um, Often it's things we're avoiding because we want to be able to talk about it more. So you've agreed on it. But the big piece is the agreement. We've agreed on the purpose, the ground rules, what we're talking about. We also want to include some time for things that went well. In some of the documents we'll be sending you, I've got some suggestions of other questions. Did you feel supported this week? How did this part go this week? So looking at also things that are working well for us and giving some space to that, including, genuine expressions of gratitude. You really like, oh, thank you for helping me clean my car this week. That was such a load off that you took care of cleaning all that stuff out that I need to get out of there. Making it enjoyable. Again, get our coffee, sit together, enjoy ourselves. It's a way of staying attuned to each other. It's a way of turning toward each other, even when we've got things that might be a little more difficult to talk about. And it's really a way of trying to seek understanding. Can I slow down enough? Can I put the distractions aside enough that actually I can actually hear my partner, that I can actually express what my concerns or needs are, around these areas. And it's that idea of the kind of non-defensive listening. A lot of times these topics, the topics that I suggest including are ones that I find often are packed with just a lot of baggage for a whole lot of reasons. I think that I think it can be easy with those kind of topics to feel so hesitant to even step into them. It can feel so overwhelming to step into them. And what often happens is, using that money example for a minute, if I'm really hesitant to talk about money, and that's the thing I avoid at all costs, I'm really trying to keep distance from it, then the times that I actually end up having to talk about money in that scenario are probably full of some conflict, some disagreement, me not feeling very secure, me not feeling like I kind of know what I'm doing. And so it's only reinforcing that desire to not talk about it. If we're able to come into these meetings, talk about things on a more routine basis, and most weeks things are fine. Most weeks our budget's not blowing up. Most weeks, yeah, we're on track. Everything's what it looks like. Oh, here's a blip. It's somebody's birthday this week. We're going to spend a little bit more. Then it helps me also remember that every conversation about money does not have to be packed with drama, with yelling, with conflict, with tears, with whatever else has sort of been in my history, but it can be done differently. So again, I truly could not give more of a vote of confidence to this approach. I've used it in my own life. I've used it with a lot of clients. And I think it can be really, really beneficial. Again, when we can be in agreement, when we can both buy in, I think that's where we can really hit that sweet spot. So let's talk about some of these challenges that come up, and how do we deal with them? What tools we can use? And the place that I like to start is this framework around red and green flag behavior. And I'm not going to read every one of these bullets, y'all. Again, a lot of words on this screen. I get it. And I want those to be there so you can sort of take those in. I'm not going to touch on each one of those in my piece of this, but let's talk about some of the themes kind of in each of these three areas. So I think when we're looking at green flags and sort of considering how they show up, the thing that kind of strikes me as the theme in there are a couple of things. One is mutual sort of respect and care. The other is the idea of reciprocity. Am I feeling like we're both invested? We're both committed to what's going on, and then there's respect. It's based in respect for those boundaries. Again, going back to something Kim mentioned earlier, when we were talking about that sort of difference between abusive relationships, we are not seeing that power difference. We are seeing that we are equal. We've got boundaries. We're both respected in that space. When we shift over and look at those red flag behaviors, again, I think we see there some of the themes that, or at least that I pull out from there, have to do with that imbalance of power, often not feeling like we can be our authentic self or that we're necessarily getting the other person's authentic self. Um, Things where we don't feel good about ourselves when we're in that space. We might be feeling belittled. We might have put downs as part of that. We might see, even if that behavior is not directed toward us, maybe we're hearing a lot of bad mouthing of, exes. And again, there can be some of that kind of comes up, I think, naturally for most folks, or I shouldn't say most folks, that can come up and not necessarily be a huge red flag. But when we're seeing that as an ongoing theme, or we're seeing, a partner getting really angry when they talk about an ex, again, just raising some of those questions. I think when we look at that idea of personal pitfalls, I included that with the idea of being able to bring in some of that self-examination. What are some of the trends that I see maybe in my own life? Am I drawn to certain folks? Do I feel more sort of settled in a relationship when I'm in the fixer role? And is that something I want to identify or not find myself kind of stepping into by default again? Am I having old relationship baggage that's getting in the way? We're going to talk about baggage in a second and sort of managing that. Noticing which things going into relationships for you tend to be kind of persistent problems, maybe that you see come up, or persistent themes that you're wanting to alter or shift a little bit. Are we making choices based on fear? And that fear can be of a whole lot of things. It can be of being alone. It can be of the idea of having another failed relationship. Sometimes I'll have folks come in and maybe they went through a divorce or a major breakup before, I said, I don't want to go through this again. I know what that was like, or, I was really committed. Maybe this really, leaving a relationship really goes against their values. They really felt like they were in this for the long haul and they're really kind of to struggle with that. So noticing within this, what are the green flags that you can identify? Where do those red flags kind of come in? And when we see them, are we dealing with them? But then especially that personal pitfalls, are there some of those areas where you're maybe not making choices in alignment with values, or you're finding yourself kind of skewed or pulled aside, by the love bombing, that's going on, and just being able to notice those so we can start addressing them. So I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the relationship house, this idea of solvable, perpetual, and gridlocked problems. And I really think this framework can help a lot when it comes to communication and trying to sort of pull some of these things apart. In any relationship between any number of people, we are going to have problems come up. Like conflict is unavoidable. And I think we often approach all problems as if they're all solvable problems. And a solvable problem is just something it's situational. A solution can be found, and so that might mean I've got to, buckle down and save money to pay to get the new washer and dryer I need, but it can be solved. I can figure out a solution. There's a definitive sort of need that's there without really a deeper meaning to it. Perpetual problems are really coming back to more fundamental kind of differences around personality, value, lifestyle. Everybody is going to have some of these. Okay. Everybody is going to have some solvables and some perpetual problems. It can be a topic that is maybe a solvable issue for somebody else. So, using that money example, kind of following that through with this, for some folks, actually, let me use a different example for this one. Um, Folks spending too much time on their phone. That is one that comes up a lot. So maybe you've got a partner who is on their phone a lot. Every time they sit down, they're pulling it up, they're, swiping and on social media or texting friends. And for some folks, that might feel like a solvable problem. This is how it feels to me when you do that. It really hurts my feelings. It makes me feel disrespected. My partner hears it. Didn't realize it felt that way. I'll do my best, and we're trying to not do this as much. Okay. For a different couple with maybe there's a history of infidelity within this couple. And part of that was done through the phone, and that's how it sort of connected and sort of played out. That is going to feel very different for that couple. Having that conversation about what it means when that one partner is picking up the phone all the time is going to feel very different. It's going to touch on bigger issues there. And that might be an issue that for the life of that partnership, kind of they circle back around to, whether that's issues around trust and commitment. Remember those load bearing walls, those bigger issues that are kind of being impacted. And so that might feel like a conversation that's got a much more nuanced set of layers. We're not just talking about that feels, that kind of irritates me in this moment. It's got all these ripples that come out from it. And so when we're dealing with solvable problems, we're talking a little bit more about sort of buckling down. Let's put our heads together. Let's figure out, do we need to save money, set aside time? What resources kind of needed? What's our plan going to be? Can we both sign on to it? When we're dealing with perpetual problems, the approach really needs to be around management of that, managing that problem. Because we know with those perpetual problems, they are going to resurface. It might be for lots of different reasons. We could go through 20 different examples, but the idea is it's those problems that keep kind of cropping back up. We're returning to it over and over again. And so with those, and we're thinking about management, then we've got to talk about how are we going to deal with it when it comes up again? When this comes up again, maybe we get into a good place around the couple with the phone issue and they get into a good place. But maybe, the partner who was looking at their phone too much says, it really hurt me when you just assumed that when I was looking at my phone, I was cheating again. Like I've told you, that's not what's going on. Like I'm committed to this relationship, but it really hurt me the way you brought that up. Well, if we know that that's probably going to circle back around again, how do we talk about it the next time? So, can we talk to each other and say, okay, when I start feeling insecure about that, how can I bring it up? What's our way to do that? How do we want to do this? And so we've got some agreed language, we've got some agreed kind of approach there. We know that we're probably going to have to face it again, and we're going to choose how we manage it a little bit differently. And I think that's where investing in how we manage it. Do we talk about it? Is this a thing? Maybe it's an issue that we only talk about when we're going to therapy or we talk about in our weekly meeting. So we put some parameters or boundaries around that. But I think being able to recognize the two different types of problems, I think can be really helpful. The third kind of area there, that idea of the gridlock perpetual problems, it's really when they kind of get solidified in the relationship. And I think those are really an outgrowth of perpetual problems that are mishandled, that we've ignored for a long time. And now, we've been dealing with this phone issue for 5 years and I've never brought it up. Every time they pick up the phone, I just go to the other room and cry. I just go to the other room and get mad and text my friend. It's been going on that way for 5 years. That's gonna be a gridlock perpetual problem. We are gonna maybe need some help in trying to pull that apart and figure that out a little bit. It can feel like sometimes discussion, maybe we have talked about something a lot and we've just not made any progress. It can start to feel pointless or like we're getting really stuck in this. And it's often related to some of those deeper issues. So I think having this framework a little bit and thinking about our approach, especially with solvable and perpetual, and it can be helpful, can help us actually make some movement in those areas. I think for, our purpose of today, noticing in your own relationship, are there any gridlocked issues that are going on that maybe need a little bit of a more nuanced approach, that need a little bit more attention? That might be, again, worth thinking about talking to somebody like me or Kim, or digging into some of these resources a little bit more with a partner to try to do some self work, reading a book together, doing a workbook together, something like that to try to kind of loosen up that conversation a little bit. All right. So now let's talk a little bit about Gottman's sort of framework around conflict and, oops, give me one second here. Um, how these things can show up, this sort of four horsemen of the apocalypse in the relationship. I don't think the framework's great for this one. Um, I think those four on the left to me are all kind of interconnected. I appreciate them kind of breaking it out in this way because I think it's a little bit easier to take in. So let's talk through the four areas for a second. We know that when we are in conflict management, we are trying to address something, that criticism, if that is coming in, that sort of verbally attacking somebody, we know it's going to bring about some defensiveness. It's not going to usually help us very much. It's going to usually become a barrier within the actual meaningful, productive conversation. So trying to move toward a gentler startup. talking about those things from that I statement. So going back to our phone example from a second ago, if I'm talking to my partner about it, being able to say, I feel really insecure when I see you pick up your phone, and whether or not that feels fair or not, this is what I'm feeling. Can we talk about it some? Can we figure out what to do about this? So being able to come from my point of view, even when we're trying to talk about behavior and how that is impacting us, we aren't wanting to start out with, why do you always pick up your phone? Every time we sit down, why can't you watch TV without just picking up the phone? Whew, that's going to have a really different response than me coming in and being able to say, it hurts me when you do this, or I feel this way, or I'm scared to bring this up. That idea of sort of bringing contempt into the discussion, attacking that sort of self, being insulting, that sort of thing. I think that's where really leaning into that culture of appreciation, being able to remind ourselves of the things that our partner brings to the table. Again, maybe in that phone example, maybe, the infidelity was 4 or 5 years ago, and you have seen lots of changes in behavior. You have seen your partner really prioritize the relationship or really make some changes that you all have discussed and needed. And so being able to also remind ourselves of that bigger picture. Yeah, I'm not happy with this phone behavior and we're going to need to talk about it, but that's not the whole story. There's been a lot of efforts over these last 4 years to really get on a better track, to really kind of build trust again. And I need to trust that I can have this conversation without bringing in all that contempt from what happened 4 years ago, but I can be in the moment here and now based on what I can appreciate that they've already done. That defensiveness, and we can all do it. I mean, all of us can do these things. This is why they are here. None of us are immune from these things coming in from time to time. So that defensiveness, us kind of putting the wall up. And I think, we know the balance for that one is looking at our part in this. We're going to talk in a couple minutes about some questions we can ask ourselves to explore our part when we're finding ourselves in spaces of conflict. And then that idea of stonewalling, so, kind of withdrawing or to avoid the conflict. So that one, think about our examples with the weekly meetings. So many things that we try to avoid talking about. Our partner wants to talk about the budget, and we are scrambling to not talk about money. I don't want to talk about how much I spent on Amazon last month. I don't want to talk about it. It makes me feel ashamed. It makes me feel embarrassed. And so sometimes we're putting those barriers up because we just don't want to go there. And I think it's where, being able to do some of that self-soothing, being able to recognize, okay, it's hard for me to talk about money, but I've agreed that Saturday morning, that is our time to do this. And I know that my partner is going to meet me with kindness, with, encouragement, with respect, because they also want me to talk about this. And so being able to remind myself, get myself in order, just some work to regulate emotion before I'm going into those conversations. That's what's going to help me get over the hump and the resistance. So I'm not just putting my head in the sand. I'm not just doing avoidance, but I'm actually able to step into something that's somewhat discomfort. That's not the word I'm wanting. Uncomfortable. Sorry. That's somewhat uncomfortable, but with the reassurance that I've got trust in my partner, that I know we're working toward the same goals, that I know that I can have a conversation and it won't be the end of the world. All right. So when we think about differences, you all, I mean, we in any time you got more than one person, there's going to be some differences, no matter what. And even if we are very similar in lots of ways, for this couple, I've kind of plotted them out in a few areas that I chose. We could have picked another 5 or 10 areas to easily do this in. And so you might see that in some areas they're super similar. Sex drive, they both got kind of a lower sex drive, but social energy, you've got one person who maybe is more of a homebody and the other who really likes to get out, who really likes that social kind of component. Anytime there are differences, it's going to be a space where there's potential for some conflict. What I want, what I need might be different than what you want and what you need. Sometimes we want to think of ourselves as being, two peas in a pod. Yeah, we're really similar in this way. Look at that work and home boundaries. Maybe we're both really great about keeping work and home separate. We really leave work at work, and that's something we're really committed to. But even within that, we got one person who's maybe a little stronger in that area or a little firmer in that area than the other. So when that person ends up taking a work call, it's their boss, and they're like, yeah, it's 8 at night, but my boss never calls, and I got to take this call. My partner, might get really upset about that. No, we said we weren't going to do this, or you said that was important to you. So even in areas where we're similar, that difference can be a point of friction. It can be a point that brings up a little bit of conflict with us. And I think especially the one I'm going to hone in on a little bit here for this conversation is around our sex drive. That is certainly an area when folks are coming in to see me. I talk to a lot of folks about relationships. I don't do couples counseling, but I'm talking to people individually about their experiences in their relationship or ways to approach some of this. This comes up very, very frequently. And it can come from all sorts of root issues, whether that is medical issues, whether there are hormone and lifespan issues that are coming into play, whether that's just demand of too much work, too much child rearing, whatever's going on, whether that's just natural libido level, just kind of where we are and how we're showing up. It definitely can be a thing that is difficult to talk about. It can be difficult for folks to talk to me about it. It can be difficult to talk to your partner about it. And I think sometimes folks even urge hard on themselves, why is it so hard to bring up? But I think that often these relationships are so important in our lives, that we don't want to have a misstep. We don't want to enter a conversation and be unintentionally hurtful to our partner. We don't want to be insulting to them in any way. We might feel embarrassed about our own body issues, our own response issues. There's a lot of vulnerability and tenderness when it comes to talking about this. So I think, a couple of things that can be useful, I think, when we've got just some differences in sex drive, regardless of what the source is. Again, that might be that at one point in your relationship, your sex life was very different than where it is now. It might be situational stuff going on. It might be a perpetual problem. Again, remember, solvable, perpetual. For one couple, this might be a solvable thing. We're like, yeah, we had really what felt like a really good, satisfying sex life for many years. And now we're hitting some issue and a medication is causing sexual dysfunction for one of us, and we're needing to deal with that. For other folks, it might be a perpetual problem, and this might have been throughout the lifespan of the relationship. We've struggled to get on the same page with this. And so, some things that we can do that can help, and I think, again, with anything, I would encourage us to not ever look at any situation with like, there's got to be one answer, there's got to be one tool. These are things that may help. So this idea of starting to date each other again, think about what attracted us to each other. How do we like to be around each other? What pulls us together? Being honest with ourselves about what we need, what our preferences are. And again, that can be a challenging thing if we've not been really open with our partners before about this. Making time for each other. So just like we talked earlier about setting time aside, if sex is a priority, then treat it that way. You know, and I think again, it's easy to get swept up in the romanticized idea that like we're going to have this like wave of desire come over us and we're going to both be right in alignment and we're going to both have energy and we're going to both feel good in that moment and nobody's going to be calling either one of us and we're going to have all the time in the world and nobody's sleepy. And that's really difficult sometimes. So if it's a priority, then how are we going to approach that? And again, what works for one couple might not be the right fit for the other. That's okay. Setting the tone, looking for ways to build intimacy throughout the day. I hear this all the time from folks. If we've been low key bickering all day, I am not dropping into sexy time just because it's 10 o'clock and the light is out. It is how do we connect all day long? Where is that connection flowing? And sometimes if we're noticing again that this is either something we just have dealt with for a long time and we just can't get unstuck, or if it's a new issue and we cannot figure out how to get over it, this is a good place to seek help. Getting some support through whether it's therapy or a doctor in some situations. It might be doing self work around a book or workbook sort of thing, but giving some attention to it. It's one of those things that I think again is very difficult for a lot of folks to step into the conversations, but some small recalibrations, just like so many other things, can really pay off. All right. So when we think about, being in conflict, we're going to grow when we're able to able to answer some of these tougher questions honestly. Really looking at our part. What's my part in the conflict? That doesn't mean that I have to shame myself, that I have to come in. I can do this with self-compassion, but I need to look at what my part of this is. Am I expecting somebody else to guess what I need? Do I fall into some of those unhealthy communication patterns or those four horsemen kind of showing up for me in some ways? So doing that self-reflection is super important in this. And then what work do I need to do to show up in the way I want to show up? Am I working in alignment with those North Star values and who I want to be? When we think about some of this sort of communication tools, just a couple of these that I want to touch on. We've talked about some of these other ones in some of the past sessions, so I'm not going to spend time with those, but I want to go to timeouts and conversation and the willing and want to. So, with this idea of sort of I want to, I'm willing to, and I won't, it's this idea of the sort of framework we agree on ahead of time, and we're able to communicate more openly with each other. So, let me give you an example because I think the example illustrates it a little bit easier. Say that I'm wanting my partner to go to my cousin's wedding with me, and we've agreed ahead of time that anytime we're asking each other to do something, these are reasonable options. I want to do that, I'm willing to do it. Maybe I'm not crazy about it, but I'm willing to, or I won't do that. It's a boundary, and I'm not going and doing that. So in that situation, I'm asking my partner to go to my cousin's wedding with me, and they might respond with, "Yeah, I'm willing to do that." And in that situation, I know that that is not how they necessarily want to spend their Saturday. It's not really necessarily maybe how I want to spend my Saturday, but it's something that's important to us. We appreciate that side of the family. We're going to go do this thing. And in that situation, I'm willing to is enough for me. Yeah, he's going to go. He's not going to be a jerk. He's going to go and be fine and do that. And we're going to both be probably pretty happy when we get back home. Maybe if I'm planning an anniversary trip for the two of us, though, and I have some idea, can we get away for this little weekend? He's like, well, I guess I'm willing to do that. Maybe in that situation, that doesn't feel like what I want. No, like I want both of us excited about this. This is something that matters to both of us. This is something for us as a couple. And so in that situation, okay, let's back up a little bit. Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's find something we both really want to do. Having this framework in terms of how we're agreeing that we are able to respond to each other, it does a couple of things. And one of the ones that I really like is I think it really helps cut off a little bit of the passive aggressive communication that can come out of situations like that. If my husband's going with me to my cousin's wedding and he's not happy about it, but I've not given him that option to say that he's willing to do it, but he's not crazy about it. If it's you got to be all in, you got to be super excited about this. He's not feeling super excited about this. His Saturday's going to something he's not crazy about doing. That's where you can see some of the outgrowth of other passive aggressive things. Is he stomping around kind of all afternoon? Is he not getting ready till late because he didn't really want to go in the first place? It gives us a chance to have some open and honest communication with each other. We still are doing the thing, but we're able to both say, like, okay, yeah, when this part's done, we're out of there. We're going to be home by 8 o'clock tonight. Whatever the things are that keep us on the same page. But I think it allows us to have, again, more authentic conversations with each other and have reasonable responses, even when we want to set some boundaries. Doing conversation timeouts, I think many of us have heard this idea of, take a timeout or step back. And one thing I want to sort of add in there, I think, again, it's an important one to talk about outside the time of conflict. We want to be able to kind of recognize this and put those limits in there, articulate when we need the timeout, and then know that when we're stepping out of that conversation, we're doing some self-soothing. We're able to kind of go into that. All right. Y'all, we're getting short on time, and so I'm going to have to move through a couple of these, and I want to leave a little bit of time at the end for Kim. When it comes to the boundary piece, a couple of things that I will just say about this piece. I think boundaries often are intimidating for a lot of us and kind of knowing where some of those limits have to set. We have also done in some of the past sessions a little more detailed discussion around the boundary piece of it. I think if boundaries are an area that are a struggle for you, I think really bringing in some of those earlier conversations with our partner, how do we want to approach this ongoing problem? How, what's okay to talk about, what's not okay, or when do we want to do it? It's a good starting space, for some of those things that we know that we're going to be talking about on a pretty routine basis. All right, so when we think about kind of doing some of our self work, that was when we come into things around managing some of our own baggage, and we all come into relationships with other baggage, with other things behind us they're going to influence how we experience that relationship. And so being able to address some of those things, whether that is through therapy, whether that's through, again, doing some self work that you might be in, noticing what things kind of get in the way, it can really help us hone in on what maybe the real issues are that need to be addressed in the relationship and what things are kind of ours to work through a little bit. I think, anytime a relationship ends, we're going to have some processing that we need to do there. I think taking a little bit of time for self-reflection, sometimes we're having to move on without the closure that we're looking for. We may be seeing themes, that have shown up, things, patterns that are there that we recognize, okay, I've had now 2 or 3 relationships that have had the same theme in it or have struggled in the same way. It may be that time to seek more of that self-understanding. Again, self-compassion, I think, is really important when we're doing this kind of reflection because it's not a space that's going to be productive to really beat ourselves up, but to really look for what need am I trying to get met by doing this behavior? What things are not working for me? And I've seen that again show up in multiple relationships. There are going to be times we've hurt and let down other people. When that happens, I think, again, being able to see how does that connect to our values? What do we want to do differently? Being able to name some of that. And I think it's especially a helpful time, again, to look for potentially therapy or something like that to do some of that self reflection. These are some of the questions that I've used with folks. I'm not going to go over all these because you'll be getting this, but these are some questions you can use when you're kind of processing relationships just to dig in a little bit more. All right, Kim, there you go.
Okay. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We want to wrap up really quickly, but I do want to make sure that you know that you will be getting these resources, and we hope that they will be useful to you as you continue to explore these ideas that we learned about today. Okay. Next slide. Sorry. So what we've also mentioned several times through here that sometimes these are ideas and concepts and needs that you might have to bring to a therapist. And these are the 4 therapists here at Health and Wellness. Your mental health therapist, Ron and I are 2 of those, and Eric are the other 2. So we really encourage you to use your sessions that you receive. Everybody gets 5 free sessions a year to use any way they like. Can you go ahead to the next slide there for me? They are confidential. And you can get them in individual and telehealth format. We serve employees, sponsored dependents, and retirees. We can also come and talk to your groups about some of these concepts in more detail, or our next program will be on work relationships, so something deeper on that as well. And those were the other resources we're going to provide you. Our next one is on November 13th. It will be part 4, working professional, and feel free to register and